Hi everybody, we've now gone live with this afternoon's session. I'm just waiting for people to come in because I know it takes a little while for Zoom to get everyone into a session, and then we will kick off. So I will give it a minute or so for that to happen. Welcome back. I hope you enjoyed this morning's session as much as I did. It was great to hear so many speakers and to really see how these kind of concepts of social reproduction have been used in so many different ways for people's research. And hopefully we will be sharing all those, the videos of all the talks this morning on our website, and hopefully also blogs or transcripts of talks as well, so people can read about them. Just to start, my name is Marion Stephenson. I'm the director of the Women's Budget Group. Welcome to this afternoon's session of our conference on social reproduction for the Early Career Network. This session is looking at theory to action. One of the things that came up in previous ECN conferences was that members wanted to find out more about how to turn academic research into policy outputs, how to influence policy, and also, you know, what ways there are of working using feminist economics in the policy sphere. So we've got a fabulous panel for you this afternoon. First, our own Marion Sharples, who's project manager of the Women's Budget Group Commission on a Gender Equal Economy, which published in September. And she's going to be talking about the commission and how it came up with concepts centering the economy around well-being. Our next speaker is Stella Creasy MP from Walthamstow, who we worked with on a number of projects over the years, particularly around trying to ensure that there is a proper impact assessment of the budget, and particularly tax. And she's going to be talking about using feminist economics in her day job. And then we're going to hear from Beti Baraki from the New Economics Foundation, and she's going to talk about how you can incorporate principles drawn from theories of social reproduction into research and policy work. And finally, we have Sian Elliot, Women's Officer at the TUC, who's going to talk about the work that the TUC has done during the COVID pandemic in relation to paid and unpaid work and the gender division of paid and unpaid work. They're all going to speak for about 5 to 7 minutes, and then there's going to be time for questions at the end. If you have questions, if you'd like to put them in the Q&A box, you're very welcome to use the chat box to speak, and we may well post links to things that people are talking about while they're talking as well. So without further ado, I would like to hand over to Marion Sharples.
Thanks, Marianne. It's really great to be here, and I am really pleased that I can share a little bit more detail about the work of the Commission on a Gender Equal Economy. I know that it was mentioned earlier in the session, in this morning's session, I think Professor Ruth Pearson was talking about it in terms of renegotiating the reproductive bargain in the current UK context. So I'm really pleased to be able to kind of dig a little deeper into the final report of the Commission now. So I will just share my screen and talk you through some of the main parts of the Commission. So what I want to do is give an overview of the report, its vision, recommendations, where progress is already underway in terms of creating a caring economy, and public support for these changes. So I'm just going to share my screen now, and hopefully everything will work as it should. Having some trouble doing that at the moment, so just bear with me. I can't seem to do it at the moment, so I will just carry on without the presentation, and I'll give it another go in a second. Or let me just, I think one thing's just clicked in now. Sorry about this.
Screen sharing is sent to try.
Oh, here we go. Perfect. I've got it now. Fantastic. Okay. Okay, can everybody see that?
We can just see a blank screen. Oh yes, we can see it now.
Perfect. Okay, sorry about that delay, painful Zoom delay when you're trying to see your screen. So this is our report, Creating a Caring Economy, a Call to Action. And as Marianne said, we launched the final report at the end of September, so around 6 weeks ago now. And it was the final report of the Commission on a Gender Equal Economy, which was set up by the Women's Budget Group in the spring of 2019. We had 17 commissioners on board, so representatives from civil society organisations, academics, business, trade unions and journalists. You can see their headshots here. You might recognise a few faces from this morning's session as well. And over the course of the commission, we collected various expert briefing papers. We had over 100 submissions of evidence. A really important element of the commission was the Four Nations approach. We travelled across the Four Nations, making sure that that the report really drew on the divergence across the Four Nations, and also we have an intersectional approach, meaning that the Commission considered multiple oppressions alongside and intersecting with gender equality. Some of the sessions that we held across the Four Nations some things which came out of the sessions that we held across the Four Nations are captured here on this slide. So what we really wanted to do in some of these sessions was to hear about the issues that are being faced by women's groups, equalities groups working on the front line. So you can see here some key issues emerging relating to childcare, social security and transport. So at the end of the project, really wrapping up our vision for a caring economy, we conceptualized it using this diagram, which you can see here. A caring economy is one which achieves gender equality, sustainability and well-being. An example of this is investment in paid care services, which improves well-being by meeting people's needs. Works to achieve gender equality because it creates more jobs, especially for women, closing the gender employment gap. And it's also sustainable because investing in care is 3 times less polluting per job created overall in the economy than the equivalent investment in construction. And it's been really interesting to see that these stats that you can see here on this screen have been picked up a lot in the few weeks since our launch. So this has clearly really resonated with people. A little bit more about what our vision of a caring economy entails. So it's one where care is central. It's one where everyone has time to care as well as time free from care. It's one where unpaid care is equally shared. And as we saw in the previous slide, paid care services is a really important part of this caring economy, but it actually goes way beyond this to kind of broader concerns about across the entire economy, which I'll pick up on more now. So yes, what we wanted to do was really show how a caring economy needs to span the different areas of the economy in its entirety. So we're looking at things ranging from reconceptualizing what we mean by the economy, reorientating our fiscal and monetary policy towards a caring economy, looking at paid and unpaid work, social security, public services, tax, right up to the global economic and trade systems. And what we wanted to do here on this slide is kind of break that down. It's obviously a huge amount of material and we wanted to kind of break it down into these 8 steps. So yeah, I won't go into too much detail here about the recommendations that we make per step, but everything is of course in the report and the executive summary, and I'll pop a link to the report itself in the chat after the presentation. Something else that we wanted to highlight in the report is that this is very much achievable. What we're calling for across these different areas of the economy is very much achievable, and that progress is already underway. So just kind of a quick whistle-stop tour of things which are already underway here, relating to step 1, which is about re-envisioning what we mean by the economy. We can look to the governments which have already adopted a wellbeing approach to economic policy, which you can see listed here as part of the group of wellbeing economy governments. Relating to step 2, which is about investment in social and physical infrastructure. We can look at Goldsmith Street in Norwich, which is an award-winning social housing project, which is also the houses are all ecologically designed. And investment in care, we can look at Denmark, which has about 11% of its population working in care, compared to 6% in the UK. And care workers are also paid significantly more in Denmark than they are in the UK, much closer to the rate of teachers. Relating to step 3, which is about paid and unpaid work, we use the example of Aviva, the insurance company, where all new parents are entitled to up to 26 weeks of parental leave at full pay, plus another 6 months of unpaid leave. And it's really interesting to see the impact of that policy. So before it was brought in, fathers were taking 2 weeks paternity leave, the standard, and following the introduction of the policy, the average length of paternity leave taken is now 22 weeks. So it's really easy to see the impact of that policy there. And a final example then is relating to step 4, which touches on social security. We can look at carers allowance in Scotland, where in 2018, the Scottish government increased carers allowance by 13%, meaning that carers in Scotland receive around an additional £450 a year compared to carers in the rest of the UK. And this year, they also made an automatic additional payment to those receiving carers allowance to provide further support during the pandemic. It's important to say that we don't think that goes far enough, but we wanted to highlight it as progress going in the right direction in any case. And alongside the final report, Creating a Caring Economy, we also conducted some polling, which shows really strong public support for urgent changes to the UK economy. And I've just popped some of the stats on this slide. They're also in our report and on our website. And I've grouped them here into 3 categories. So in the turquoise box, we can see high levels of public support for an increased focus on well-being and getting a better balance in life. In the yellow box, we can see support for gender equality, particularly in encouraging men to provide more care. And interestingly, this was the case among women and men, with really high levels of support among men aged 18 to 44. In those age groups between 18 and 44, nearly 3/4 of men agreed that the government should encourage and financially support men to provide more care, which I think is really interesting to see those high levels among that group. And in the blue box, we can see support for specific policy proposals which the report made, particularly around investment in social infrastructure and making sure that social care is available, is based on needs and not on people's wealth. And I think we can see here that there's really strong support for this, which is really useful for us in terms of making the case to policymakers. We can see that people want to see these changes. We can see it makes economic sense, looking at the higher returns to investment in care, which I had on a previous slide, and also on the slide just before this, demonstrating how progress is already underway. So I think with those 3 things, we can make this case for building a caring economy now. So that's it. That's all I wanted to cover in my few minutes. I hope I haven't gone over time too much. And these are the details here to where you can find the report, find the executive summary in my email as well. I'm very happy to have any further conversations with people about it.
Thank you, Marion. That was great, really concise for what is a really, really comprehensive and far-reaching report. And, you know, it's really good to see that it's being picked up by politicians and think tanks and other journalists who are particularly looking at the issues around care and a care-led recovery. So our next speaker is Stella Creasy, MP for Walthamstow, who, as I said, we have worked with on a number of different campaigns over the years, and we're delighted she's able to join us today. And she can give a personal view, I guess, of how she brings feminist economics into her work, but also what's useful for her as an MP when people who might have a great deal of research expertise might want to communicate that research to MPs. So, Stella.
Thanks, Marianne, and thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this today, which I think is phenomenally important. I come at this probably as a poacher turned gamekeeper, possibly pheasant in this whole conversation, having been a researcher myself, someone who's very determined to use data within Parliament and who is avowedly a feminist economic person. After all, if you're not, why not, would always be my question. I would encourage everybody on this call to take what I would consider to be a very Thatcherite approach to the importance of feminist economics. Thatcher said that economics are the method, the objective is to change the heart and soul. So for me, what research does and what powerful data does is to help. It's almost like that, I always think of it like the Wonder Woman X, as a way of deflecting often what happens when you start talking and championing ideas around social justice and inequality, especially in Parliament, especially if you are a woman, is it deflects the mansplaining and it deflects the prejudice, because it helps to cut through some of the assumptions about what actually makes our economy work. What do I mean? Let me give you some practical examples. And in particular, as Marianne says, we've worked very closely together on a number of campaigns, a number of issues. One most recently looking at the impact of the tax system on women and how, in fact, the changes that the governments are making were disproportionately affecting women. And it was a great example of something that's often very true, especially when it comes to tackling inequality and injustice in society, which is what is not talked about is as influential as what is talked about. So we were pushing the government to do an equalities impact assessment of the changes they were making to the tax and benefit system to women. To help them understand what we were talking about, we gave them a shorthand. We called it lady data. And lady data was a great way of explaining to them what was missing from their understanding of how they were making policy and the impact they would make. And I think Marianne's work was very powerful in setting out where, when you do take a different perspective, you can get a different result that might lead to all sorts of policy changes that you hadn't thought about. Our current political debates are riddled with examples where there is an absence of data and an absence of understanding of the consequences of changes that are being made. The way in which the government is responding to coronavirus is a case in point on this. We know we are now facing what I call a tsunami of mum unemployment in this country. And the data has started to trickle through to help explain that, but the conversation at a national level is by no means informed by it. So there's a real opportunity to not just change a conversation, but start a conversation on it. What do I mean by that? So we know there's some research that came out from Oxford University in June that showed that mums were 10% more likely than dads to be furloughed. We followed that up with the data that's now come from the ONS that started to look at why it is that of the 45% increase in redundancy, 79% of that has come from women. But the truth is, the evidence about where particular groups of women are being affected, that lady data, is few and far between. So I guess I'm here today as one of those poachers termed gamekeeper pheasants to implore you to share your data, because the conversations that desperately need to be had in this country to help constituents like mine need and deserve that data to show what is really happening on the ground. When we did the work with the Women's Budget Group about the way in which the tax and benefit system was disproportionately hitting women, we were able to show that women were paying for 80% of the cuts that the then coalition government were making. It was an incredibly powerful moment in the conversations in Parliament about why was it particular groups in society were paying the price more than others. The same is true now with coronavirus. The same is true in the ways in which particularly women of colour are being affected by the decisions that the government is making. But without the data, we're back, as I say, facing the barrage of prejudice and mansplaining about what really matters and why, when you're in an economic crisis, the most important thing you can do is get the hospitality sector working, because that will help women, whilst failing to recognise that 2/3 of women cannot get back to work, whether they work in a restaurant, a school, or indeed a bank, because they haven't got childcare. So my big message to you today is that data really does make a difference. The way in which you connect with us as policymakers is absolutely crucial. But if you've got data that shows the impact of changes or lack of changes, and I think that's what the Caring Society research is so powerful at doing, that you can share, please do share it, because there are many of us here in the mother of all parliaments desperately to speak up for mothers and women alike. But we need that data to be able to perform the Wonder Woman to back off from those people who want to tell us that at a time of economic crisis, the most important thing is austerity. To give you just one example of one of the things that we've been working on for a long period of time is, if you were to close the gender pay gap, you would add £600 billion to the economy. At the moment, that conversation about closing the gender pay gap has completely disappeared off the government's agenda. Indeed, it was the only piece of business reporting that the government decided to cancel during the coronavirus crisis, was to stop them doing gender pay gap reports. being able to bring that back in and being able to bring in data about the powerful impact and positive impact it would have on our economy has started to change the conversation here in Parliament. Now, it's hard work to do. It does require good economic assessment. I won't stand up for my colleagues in terms of those who may not be able to understand every dot, every comma, every logistic regression you might take. But I promise you, data does cut through some of the flim and the flam. Don't listen to those in government who might say that experts are overrated. Actually, expertise is needed all the more. And the final thing I would say is to recognise that the battles that we're facing, the politics of this, aren't about women. This isn't about how can we help women compete in the world that we're working in right now. For me and for many of my colleagues who are desperately interested in the work that you're all doing and desperately interested in the benefits of taking a different approach in the work that the Women's Budget Group do, it's about how we change the environment that we ask women to walk into. I'm acutely conscious that often in politics, women get treated as a homogenous lump. They're generally the difficult people who are on the outside trying to get in on the inside. Using data to prove the benefits of bringing women in and having a diverse understanding of their needs, their wants, their abilities, their capabilities, and what impact that has on our economy and our society changes conversations. And whether those are conversations about economics or wider heart and soul issues, I'm sure Margaret Thatcher would be proud of us.
Thank you, Stella. Your inbox may be very full over the next few days and weeks as people start sending you their research. So that's great. Hopefully that can happen, and that, you know, we will see you asking a question that comes from somebody's PhD research who's at this conference today, or other research they're doing. That's great. Really good to hear from you. Thank you very much. Just to let everyone know, Stella unfortunately has to leave us at 2 because she has to go to a select committee meeting. And
I have to go and have some free, frank and full words with the leader of the Labour Party.
Okay. That's
about equalities issues.
About equality. So she will be disappearing, but it's not a lack of interest. And as she said, do send her your data. So our next speaker is Beti Baraki from the New Economics Foundation, who we're delighted to have with us here today. Again, Beti's somebody who we have worked with on joint projects with NEF over the last couple of years. I'm really pleased to have her here with us today. And she's going to be talking about how you can incorporate principles of social reproduction into research and policy work, drawing on some of her specific research experiences. So Beti, over to you.
Thank you, Marianne. Thank you very much for having me here. It's great to be here. So I'll be briefly talking about the impact of the circumstances that we find ourselves in and the impact of COVID on women in our work at NEF. So one of the things we've learned from the pandemic is how important social reproduction is to the functioning of our economy. The COVID-19 pandemic struck after over a decade of austerity, justified by the economic crisis of 2008, has been severely impacting various groups of people. The crisis has ensued, exposes the systemic flaws in our public services, social security, and economy. Our economic model is based on unsustainable, extractive, profit-making activities, while at the same time, social reproduction activities that sustain and nurture human life and well-being, such as childcare, healthcare, education, violence against women and girls services, and other forms of social care services, have been extremely under-resourced. As a result, we're now witnessing public services barely able to cope with the crisis, and existing inequalities exacerbated with a disproportionate impact falling on women and BME people. At the same time, COVID has also revealed the extent to which our society and economy is reliant on social reproduction workers or essential workers. The vast majority of these are women, BME people, and also migrant workers. In fact, our research shows that women in employment are twice as likely to be essential workers as employed men, making significant contribution to their communities, but also facing biggest health risks. Women also carry out around 60% more unpaid work than their male counterparts, leading them to be less financially secure. Migrant women are particularly overrepresented in key worker sectors. For example, nearly half of nannies are migrant women, and they're often subjected to increasingly restrictive and hostile immigration policies, as well as harsh and exploitative working conditions. Women have been more likely to lose their jobs than men in the COVID-19 economic crisis, and they're more likely to take on extra housework and caring responsibilities, whether they're working or not. The pandemic has shown us how those who are critical to the functioning of society have been largely invisible, grossly underpaid, with little to no bargaining power. Research has long shown us that feminized labor is extremely devalued because women have such low status in our society, and caring is simply regarded as something innate to women. This is inherently women's work, invisible and unrecognized economically. In light of the current crisis, we need a radical rethink of how women's labor is valued. We are currently working with a number of local authorities and combined local authorities to support them in addressing the root causes and drivers of inequality. NEF supports proposals for universal basic services as central to its mission for a new social settlement. And I'm going to briefly highlight NEF's work on childcare sector as an example. As it stands, our childcare system is characterized by a very fragile infrastructure. It's one of the most expensive costs in England. Childcare in England for the youngest children costs between 45% to 60% of women's salaries. Many providers in the poorest areas are facing closures. It's projected around 150,000 childcare places could close within the next 12 months. The poorest families are unable to access childcare due to the high cost and loss of childcare places in the area, as the private providers prefer to go to richer areas. There is a serious risk that there will be mass redundancies and many childcare providers will be unable to reopen, and working conditions are quite poor for workers. NEF's analysis suggests that investment in quality, accessible childcare is an investment in essential social infrastructure with long-term benefits for the economy and society. Investment would boost the economy and jobs more than private provision does. It has positive impact on women through removing barriers to employment and relieving the stress of care work on their mental health, and as well on children, as it helps close the attainment gap between children from low income families and their higher income families. So at NEF, we proposed the creation of a childcare infrastructure fund to sustain the childcare sector and its workforce. This would be a direct payment for all registered providers to cover all staff salaries, raising them to the real living wage, order and maintain continuity of care and protect this essential infrastructure. This will secure the sector and begin the long-term reforms required to ensure a universal service is available and affordable to all families who want to use it. Additionally, we support a democratic childcare sector by increasing the role of local authorities, cooperatives, and not-for-profit providers, enabling different models of ownership and a shift of power from employers to workers and people using the services. For example, give local authorities the right to buy existing nurseries at point of sale and incentivize a shift to worker-owned provisions by introducing a worker buyout option at the point of sale of nurseries. Ensure better pay rate and protection and collective voice for childcare workers so that workers are well paid and protected in a way that reflects their critical contribution to society. Implement these changes via a regulatory framework in the form of a charter for childcare. And then finally, this would go hand in hand with an end to hostile environments so that the women worst affected by the inequality within the sector are also able to benefit from the proposed interventions. So the pandemic is exposing how social services are critical for the functioning of the economy and necessary for human life and well-being. And high quality services should be made universally available to all, and workers' contributions should be highly paid and recognized and fairly paid. One way of ensuring this for childcare is for it to be recognized as a universal basic service, which would enable a permanent structural change to become a reality. So I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Beti. It's really good, I think, for people to hear how think tanks, or I mean, I think NEF is a think and do tank, can kind of take forward these ideas, both in kind of research and policy work, but also in practical work with local authorities, actually making a difference on the ground, and to see how people can take that kind of expertise from an academic framework and use it in a policy setting. So that's great. Our next speaker is also somebody who we have worked with at the Women's Budget Group over the years, Sian Elliot, who is the Women's Officer from the TUC. Sian is going to talk about the work that the TUC has done during the COVID-19 pandemic, particularly around paid and unpaid work and the gender division of paid and unpaid work. And as we know very well at the Women's Budget Group, the gender division of unpaid work is at the heart of inequalities with the gender division in paid work. So Sian, over to you.
Thank you very much, Marianne, and thank you to Anna and to all at Women's Budget Group for inviting me here today. And I just want to say a really special thank you for your work throughout this pandemic. You've been tireless in your efforts to highlight the disproportionate impact that this crisis is having on women, particularly those most marginalised women with intersecting identities, and also to present policy ideas and solutions that bring us closer to a gender equal economy, one with care at its core. So a big personal thank you from me and all at TUC. As Marianne said, I'm the Women's Equality Policy Officer at the TUC, so I lead on all matters relating to women in the workplace, our rights, our economic security and independence. And during the crisis, I've been conducting research to record and report on the impact that the pandemic is having on women. Because what we do at the TUC, along with our affiliated trade unions, where we collectively represent over 6 million working people, is fight for equality in the workplace and outside of it, whether that's organising for equal pay, highlighting systemic sexism and racism in the workplace through driving reports and data and research and proposing policy solutions, changes in practices at government and employer level, or fighting to have care work, both paid and unpaid care work, recognised, valued and rightfully rewarded. Women trade unionists have long organised around the call for the recognition of the different forms of labour performed by women, and highlighted through research and through case studies of real lived examples of the gender division of that labour, namely in the form of how domestic labour and care work is unequally divided between men and women, which is both the cause and consequence of our unequal power relations, but the impact that that unpaid care work has on women's ability to maintain paid work. According to the UN, women carry out at least 2.5 times more unpaid household and care work than men. And as a result, we have less time to engage in paid labour or work longer hours. And so as far back as the 1970s, activists in our movement, but also outside of it, women's rights activists, organised around the rallying cry of wages for housework. And this was so revolutionary because it positioned women as workers, connecting our unpaid housework and reproductive work through the prism of paid work and applying trade union organising strategies to it. The home became our workplace with good or bad working conditions and pay, with exploitative or non-exploitative practices, and that our role and the labour we perform is to be negotiated. It's not a natural expectation or innate part of who we are as women, partners, lovers, mothers, daughters, sisters. And that demand of wages for housework, I think, is still so relevant today in the work that we're doing at the TUC and that our trade unions are doing, and the work of Women's Budget Group and others, because the value that women's unpaid work adds to our economy still goes woefully, and I would add conveniently, unrecognised. A UN report found that unpaid care and domestic work is worth around 10 to 30% of a country's gross domestic product, contributing more to an economy than manufacturing, commerce or transportation sectors. And it's that kind of vital data that Stella was talking about that we need to get out there and into the public domain. So we're shaping conversations on the economy around that information, because women's unpaid work subsidises the cost of care that sustains families, supports economies, and fills in for the lack of adequate social services, yet it is rarely recognised as work. but without it, our world would collapse. And never has that been more obvious than in the last 6 months. It's been women and our labour, stacking shelves, manning tills in shops and supermarkets, cleaning hospital wards, caring for the elderly, the young, the sick, working in our hospitals and our schools, public services, that has kept people alive and our country going. And this pandemic has come with many new challenges, exposing and magnifying the inequalities for women that I've just mentioned. And so we at the TUC have been really seeking to make sure we're recording this and putting it in the hands of policymakers so that we can change decision making on this area. For example, the decision to close schools and childcare settings, whilst understandable as a means of preventing the spread of COVID, had a disproportionate impact on women. 1 in 6 working mums that we surveyed said that they'd had to reduce their hours at work or drop out of the workplace altogether in order to balance work and childcare. And that was overwhelmingly women in the lowest paid jobs. So those that can least afford it were having to lose more of their income. Our research also found, we did a survey of over 3,400 new and expectant mums. 71% of new mums couldn't find the childcare they needed to return to work. And 1 in 4 pregnant women had been treated unfairly at work during the crisis, including being singled out for furlough and redundancy. And we know that it's at that crucial point, the start of motherhood, that the gender pay penalty really starts to bite. 2.7 million women became carers during the crisis. This was analysis done by Carers UK. They began caring for partners, elderly relatives, neighbours or friends. And that burden fell largely on older women workers, those aged 55 and over, who became the fastest growing economically inactive group. They were leaving work to step in and step up to meet that explosion in care need. And that action will worsen the gender pension gap that women of this age group face. Research done by one of our trade unions, Prospect, found that the gender pension gap in September stood at 40%. So a 65-year-old woman retiring now has a pension pot worth around 1/5 of a man of the same age. And that's a result of the accumulation of pay discrimination women experience, occupational segregation, but also a lack of proper social security benefits that mitigate for and remunerate women for the time that they take out of the workplace during their careers to care. But I wanted to say that the pandemic has also come with opportunities. Before the crisis, care work was seen as unskilled, non-essential and remunerated accordingly. And TUC's analysis showed that social care workers are paid appallingly, often below minimum wage. They're kept on insecure or agency contracts that make it hard for them to plan household budgets or childcare, because you never know when your next shift will be and you can't risk turning it down. Well, that workforce now in the COVID context are seen as vital, skilled, essential to our economic and social well-being. So much so that every Thursday during lockdown, we came out of our houses to clap for them. But I know it will come as no surprise to anyone here that that workforce are predominantly women, 83%, many of whom are migrant or Black and minoritized ethnic women. And that care work is low paid because of who it was connected to, because it was connected to women's unpaid work in our homes and communities. And I think this is our opportunity as researchers, as influencers and lobbyists to organise around this door that's been pushed open around who performs care work, at what cost, but also the vital role that it plays in society. We need to capitalise on the goodwill and feeling that Marion's slide was showing us earlier towards these issues. We need to have research that highlights the burden of care as a structural issue, that the inequalities experienced by women are a result of the unequal division of care and not a result of individual actions and decisions, but a result of policies and measures that disproportionately impact and disadvantage women. And it's the power of those policies that we need to organise around, and we're doing so at the TUC, because if policies can worsen inequalities, they can also work to reduce and eradicate them. We need policies that redistribute the division of care. So driving greater share of care between parents, for example, by reforming the parental leave system. So dads are entitled to more than a paltry 2 weeks of paternity leave when their child is first born. And evidence coming out of Scandinavian countries shows that has a positive impact on mum's earning potential and dad's time spent caregiving in later years, when dads are given a longer period of paid individual leave. We also want to move to a 4-day week and for all workers to have a day one right to flexible work, so that everyone has time to care, exactly like Marion was saying, and can balance work and care without having to sacrifice either. We're also lobbying for policies that improve pay and condition of women working in the social care and childcare sectors. So research and data around what a difference that would make is really important for us, and the meetings that we then go on to have with employers, with those running our big public sector services, but also with MPs. And we need to push for an end to exploitative 0 hours contracts, a raising of the minimum wage to a level that women and their families can live on. And we support our unions so that they can negotiate directly in workplaces to strengthen and improve upon that minimum floor of rights, and provide the evidence that shows what an economic impact that will have. I will finish them, Marianne, and I'm conscious I may go over time, but thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sian. That was perfectly timed, I think, and really important to link those issues about paid and unpaid work to things like leave policies, which, as you say, establish a set of norms about who's responsible for looking after new babies, which continues throughout parenthood for both women and men, as we've seen, and as we were hearing earlier this morning, affecting women during the closure of schools and nurseries. So now it's time for questions for the panel. We've had one question in so far. I'd urge everyone, if you've got a question, please post it in the Q&A, and you can join with your videos. Oh yes, so yeah. Please post your question in the Q&A. So the first question that we've had says, and this is specifically to Marion, but I think other people might want to comment on it. The report mentions changing the language around work, but seems to suggest expanding the meaning of terms such as productivity and efficiency to include well-being. However, should we perhaps try to move away from this terminology and try to create a new vocabulary? If so, what terms could we use? Marion, I don't know if you want to answer that one first.
Yeah, sure, I'll kick off with that. I think that would be such a useful, like, if we had like a brainstorming session, you know, to come up with alternative ways, alternative like vocab to think about these issues. So just to kind of give some context for people who might not have read the report. So one of the arguments we make in the report is that this idea of productivity is kind of, you know, heralded as one that everything we should focus on, you know, and what we do in the report is just tease that out, really. We say, you know, not only is it something that, you know, there are more important things that the economy should be focusing on, but also the way in which productivity is currently understood can mask a lot of the unpaid labour, which we are trying to, you know, shed a light on, and how important it is. So, for example, in the report, we use the example of if a hospital announces that overnight stays in hospitals are reduced by a certain amount, and, you know, we say that that is the result of increased productivity in the hospital. What that actually means is that somebody has to, you know, that the patient leaving the hospital has to be picked up, has to be taken home, and has to be cared for if they're leaving the hospital earlier. And so then we're talking about, it's not an increase in productivity as such, it's a transfer of that labour from the paid labour market to the unpaid labour market, and to unpaid labour. And also, we need to think about who is going to be likely to be doing that work, who's going to be picking up the slack, who's going to be taking on that burden. I think, yeah, another example that we use is about increased productivity among workers, but also the need to take into account the cost at which that happens in terms of impacts on well-being and mental health as a worker. And, you know, if you can produce something, if you can produce more of something within an hour, okay, that's one part of the story, but what's the rest of the story? What has the impact on that worker's well-being and their mental health, for example, been? And why do we not measure that? Why is that not taken into consideration? So just a bit of background there to kind of why we were teasing out the issues around productivity. In terms of using different language, I think there's definitely a case for it. I think it's really important to be talking more about quality, particularly when we're talking about care, for example, the quality of care that's provided, whether it meets people's needs as opposed to productivity and efficiency. I think those concepts are really difficult and problematic when we're talking about relational work. So I think, yeah, I would suggest focusing more on quality and meeting needs. But I think there's also an argument for reclaiming those words that we use, productivity and efficiency, in the same way that we are, you know, a lot of this report and a lot of the work that we do is about redefining what we mean by the economy itself. So maybe it's about coming up with a more a broader, a more nuanced and a more just a different definition of these words, you know. So I would say there's an argument for both sides. We could come up with alternatives, or we could reclaim them. But yeah, those are my thoughts on that.
Thanks, Marion. I mean, I think it's a really important tension, isn't it, that we often face, where, you know, you want to use language that resonates, that the people that you're talking to understand. So if you're talking to policymakers who are very concerned about productivity, engaging in that discussion about productivity, both unpicking notions of productivity, but also thinking about productivity in feminist terms, can be really useful. On the other hand, you can end up reinforcing concepts that you're actually trying to challenge. And I think that's the challenge that we often face as people working in feminist economics, that tension between kind of using existing language that everyone understands and trying to unpick or broaden it, and actually saying, do you know what, this term is lost, we need a different term, and how you get people to engage with that. Beti and Sian, I don't know if either of you have got anything to add on that question. Beti.
Yeah, I agree with both Marianne and Marion. And I think for NEF, rather than we know that productivity or GDP are not, like, have been measuring the wrong things. They don't really tell us the full story of how people are doing. And what we prioritize at NEF is well-being. So we look at indicators on mental health, education, quality of life, happiness, as well as needs. That is not to say we don't look at productivity or GDP, but we know it doesn't tell us the full story.
Thank you. Sian, what about the TUC? I mean, obviously productivity is a conversation that trade unions are often very heavily involved with. So how do you deal with that tension?
I think it's much as Beti was just saying, and you and Marion have both said, we have to start by rooting it in people's everyday lived experiences and using accessible language. I think sometimes when it comes to the economy and conversations around economics, it can become really opaque. It can seem very academic, and that actually acts as a barrier, and a deliberate barrier, I think, at times, to keep certain people excluded from a conversation. And so I think I would say there's a balance of using the language that you need to engage policymakers and engage an audience, but there's also something about redefining language and using language that actually is relevant to people's everyday lived working experience. What makes a difference to them? And we know that's pay, that's working conditions. And I worry too about the use of productivity. And an example is GMB Union are running a really big campaign, Amazon, We Are Not Robots, where productivity and this relentless focus on productivity, seeing it only as something quantifiable, how many boxes have you put on your shelf and how many are getting out the door, that means there is no room, there is a complete dehumanization of workers to the point where they don't have time to go to the bathroom, where they don't have time to just take a breath, to make a mistake. They are treated as a robot. And I think that there is that use of productivity, and some of these terms are so cold, and they just miss any of the human aspect that we so desperately need. And so I think there's a real need to redefine those terms, but also find other terms for talking about how our staff, what's the output, what are we doing at work, how is everybody feeling, as well as what's the productivity that they're producing. I think really important question, and really good for us to be thinking about it.
And I think very much that this will be something that we are looking to explore in the next session, when we're talking about early career experiences of COVID-19, and particularly the experiences of PhD students and academics at the beginning of their career, in terms of the productivity pressures they're facing within universities, and particularly at the moment with a pandemic, where people are also facing pressures in their domestic life, looking after children, worrying about parents and so on. So we'll come on to that later. The next question very much relates to a point that Sian just made about using everyday language, I think, which says, can you suggest one action that we could possibly do right now as an early career researcher that could get our work, possibly still in progress, in front of policymakers and politicians, excluding emailing Stella? Thank you. So I guess the thing here is partly about, what could people do right now, but also, for Sian and Beti and Marion, all of whom have been involved in different ways in influencing policymakers, but have, solidly grounded in research. What do you think it's important when you're communicating with policymakers in terms of kind of language, style, how you would go about it, all of those sorts of things? Sian, I don't know if you want to go first on that one.
I'd keep it brief. In terms of being very practical, if you want to get your research in front of someone for it to have an impact, and I'm still learning this in when I communicate to others about research I've done, keep it as brief, keep it as impactful. What are your key points, and what are the key actions or recommendations that you have coming out of that data? But another thing that I think as women, as feminists, we are brilliant at is building alliances, building networks. And it's something that I have sought to do at the TUC, is to really work collectively with as many people as possible, to be sharing data, to be sharing ideas, to be pulling that all together, because we often can end up working in silos. And I think it's so important to just bring that network together. And that's what we do as feminists. We work really well collaboratively. We know it's core to achieving what we want when we're up against an unequal power system. So on a practical level, keep it brief, get it in front of people however you can, engage with them on social media, engage with them via email, by going to events and asking really good questions like this, but also keep networking exactly as you're doing here today, because I think that's another way to really expand your voice and your influence.
Beti, any thoughts?
I would literally echo Sian's point. I think keeping it concise. We always at NEF say to have like 3 key points or 5 key points, so that people can just remember it easily. And also right now, part of the making policy successful is also reliant on building coalitions. And so I would say that make sure that you are like networking and being part of the bigger coalitions that are existing right now, with like Build Back Better and women's sector. Like more and more voices are getting involved, trying to make changes. So I would encourage everybody to network and get behind these coalitions.
Thank you. Marion.
Yeah, I think it's such an important question, and I would totally agree with what Sian and Beti said. Just to add a couple of things, one thing that I found really useful myself in like trying to distill some of this work, which is, it's different. I'm not an early career researcher or anything, but how to kind of condense something so big like this report which we wrote, which is 80 pages long. And one thing that I find really helpful is writing a blog, writing a short article, having a word limit, and forcing myself to just reduce it. Yes, the 80 pages, that's great. Who's going to read 80 pages? Not many people, no politicians. So how can we actually get that on one side, on 2 sides? What are the most important things, I also think really thinking about who the audience is and tweaking it accordingly to that is really, really crucial. Making sure that you don't alienate people with language, making sure that language is useful, and making sure that you've got a few people to read it who aren't academics and who, you know, who can point out and say things, I don't understand what this means, I don't understand that. And, you know, I think it's so important not to alienate people, because they'll just switch off. If someone doesn't understand a concept that you're talking about, they'll just disengage, they'll just dismiss it and just think, oh, I don't know what this is talking about, something else, you know. So I think that's really important about as well, about using inclusive language and not being alienating. But yeah, I think I would say those two things. Force yourself to write a blog or a short article on it, and start pitching it, start getting it out there, you know, start seeing, you know, do some research about who you want to reach, where do they read stuff, how can you get a blog in there, can you get an article, can you pitch something, and just training yourself to kind of, yeah, as the others have been saying as well, keep it concise, and keep it accessible.
I think those are all really good points. I mean, from my own experience as somebody who kind of went from campaigning and policy work into academia and then back out again, I suppose, I mean, the things that I was constantly being told I was doing wrong when I was doing my PhD, like you can't write with bullet points and you can't start with three key, you know, my three most important points are, you know, you have to start with your literature review and show that you know, your empirical research is grounded in some sort of theoretical framework. Policymakers aren't interested in your theoretical framework. They're not really interested in your literature review unless it's about further evidence that you're bringing to bear. So you might say, you know, we've done this research on X, which shows these three things, and this is backed up, you know, is in line with previous research, which shows X, Y, and Z. So then you can cite previous research. So there's an awful lot of thinking about what works for different audiences. And I would very much emphasize what other speakers have said, that for policymakers, you need to keep it really short. You need to think about explaining things in simple language. You need to start with your most important points. You know, what is the problem? Some key facts to back up why this is a problem, what they need to do about it. The thing that politicians really want to know is, what should I do as a result of this? Because otherwise it's just like, oh, that's interesting. So, you know, are you asking them to ask a question in Parliament? Are you asking them to raise this with a minister? Are you writing to the minister, asking them to change their policies on a particular area? And all of those things where you have a very, very concrete ask, I think makes a difference. I mean, the other thing I would say as members of the ECN, you know, one of the things that we try to do as the Women's Budget Group is translate people's academic research into reports and policy briefings that can be used and it can have an impact. And a lot of the things that we publish are written by our members based on their academic research. So if you have research that you think is interesting and you think might make a good report or a briefing, or even just a couple of stats within a briefing, you know, please do get in touch with us and let us know what it is, and we can talk to you about it, and we can also help you translate it into language that may resonate better with policymakers. Generally speaking, as I said, they're not interested in theoretical concepts so much as data and suggestions for what should be done differently. We haven't got any more questions in the chat, so unless anybody wants to post anything very quickly now, what I'm going to do is ask all of the speakers for their kind of final remarks and thoughts, and then I am going to say a little bit about the next session, because there's some things to do with web links that you all need to know about. So final thoughts. Beti, is there any final thoughts you wanted to add?
Well, I think one key thing that I would probably want to add to the last point is to not get scared of emailing people who work at think tanks or policymakers, or you know, contacting them via Twitter, because a lot of people are actually interested in supporting younger people and helping them out. So I'll probably say that.
That's a really good point, actually. Sian?
Yeah, absolutely agree with Beti there. Engage with as many different people in positions of power and ability to influence to expand the reach of your research. I think that's a great idea. And to say that, Marion, my dad proofread everything that I handed in for my master's. And it was brilliant because he didn't have a fiddlestick what I was talking about, but he always said, if I can follow it, then you know anyone can follow it. And if I can't, then you as the writer need to come back to that again. And it proved very true. And I got him to thank my master's. So I think that's a great piece of advice.
And finally, Marion.
Cool, good to hear, Sian. I'm glad it all worked. I would just say, just given the kind of previous question that we had, I would also say have faith in your research. Like, your research is powerful, your research is crucial. You know, the decisions that are being made, you know, somebody's done the research which are backing them up most of the time. So I would just say have faith in your research and be proud of it and get it out there because people need to hear about it.
That's a really good message to finish on, Marion. Thank you very much. And thank you to all our panelists, to Sian, Beti and Marion, and also to Stella, who had to leave us. That's been a really fascinating session. Before we go into the break, I just want to let you all know about the next session, which is on early career experiences of COVID-19. And this includes speakers, the launch of a new Women's Budget Group report about the impact of COVID-19 on women early career researchers, as well as presentations from Pandemic, PGR, and the Smarten study, which is looking at mental health in academia during the pandemic. Because there is going to be some breakout sessions and group work, we're using a different link for this session. So the link for it is in your program for the day. So it won't be this link that you have to come back to. Anna has just posted the web link in the chat just now. So at 2:45, when you come back from your break, please use that web link. This is because of the various vagaries of Zoom. You can have a kind of webinar style event, or you can have an event which allows people to be put into breakout rooms and so on, but you can't move from one to the other in the same event, which is a bit of a frustration, but there you go. So we're going to be doing a new web link for that. And that session is starting at 2:45. And then the final session is our keynote session with Tithi Bhattacharya, who is going to be talking about her work on social reproduction theory. So that's going to be great. I'm really looking forward to that. Thank you all very much for attending this session. Thank you to the participants. Thank you again to Anna for organising, and we'll see you in about 45 minutes. Bye-bye.